hi Tia.
Hi Jason.
Thanks for coming down.
Pleasure.
And it's going to be an interesting conversation today. But firstly, I think we should maybe begin on how we first met. I can remember driving to work down the M11, listening to Radio 4, as I normally do. And I was listening to this show, and it was you. And I thought, wow, what an interesting story this guy's got. And part of the story that I can recall, really there was some similarities with me and me growing up during the 1970s and the early 80s. And some of the points that you were making really resonated with me. And that really inspired me to really give you a call or contact you and just find out more about you as a person and what you do. So I think today would be good just to have a chat and see if we can, discuss some of those similarities. I know we're of different ages, so we grew up in different times, but it's interesting how we pretty much encountered the same challenges or very similar growing up.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was one of the things that really fascinated me about our connection in that sense, was that obviously I was born in 1990 and I was born with my father being Pakistani and my mother being English, but experiencing racism on both sides of that, with my Pakistani family being quite appalled that my father had had a child with a white woman, and then equally my mum's family being appalled that she'd had a child with an Asian man. Being in that community, being in a predominantly white English community that was quick to pick that side of me that was Pakistani and weaponize that against me. And that is the backdrop of my childhood and the way that I related into the community. And really growing up without that sense of belonging and without that sense of connection to either parent, as well as my mum struggled to connect with me. As she admitted, she only hugged me for the first time when I was 14 years old. My dad was nowhere to be found, and then men that came into the house and would eventually become my stepdad would abuse me in different ways and were very racist themselves and would tell me Enoch Powell had it right and things like that. But I remember talking to you, and you suffered a very similar thing, even as a white man, around your Irish heritage, which I found really interesting, and the similarity of being in England as well as being in another country, and so then meeting that side of you and treating you for that side, but then also your Irish family around your English side. So I thought that was a really unique connection which I hadn't considered before and I hadn't explored with somebody.
Yeah, and I don't think many people do. I think just because somebody's white, they can still have dual heritage. And people don't seem to see that unless they hear the story. And yeah, you're quite right. I think my mother came from Dublin. She came over in the 1960s. And she came over with a family which she already had, which are my half-brothers and sisters, if you like. She came to this country, to the UK, hoping to find work. Sadly, she was with a husband that abused her quite badly. Eventually, that marriage broke down in London. He then left. She then met an English chap who was my father, and he already had a family which were pretty much East End type characters. And then we all ended up moving into one house. Now, as you can imagine, you have, an East End type white family. At those times in the 70s, it was quite racist in East London. There was lots of racial hatred. My mother came over in the 60s and she was the one that was subject, just like the people from the West Indies, no blacks, dogs or Irish people. And that was quite common. And I think the younger generation struggled to get their heads around that actually happened. So we were all living in one house as a mixed race family, if you like. But there was more racial hatred from the English side to the Irish side. The Irish side were always kind of laid back. But for me, stuck in the middle, as like you, I was the lad that was half Irish, half English, Now, where do my loyalties lie? To which family? And that's something that caused me lots of anguish and trouble over the years.
Yeah, I wonder which way you went, because I know which way I went. I went to the English side, and I kind of disproportionately tried to make myself English. I really got into chav culture, and would wear England shirts and so on. And I really had a lot of denial. I mean, now I would call it internalized racism around that Pakistani side of me. And so if somebody was to call me a racial slur, call me the P word, I would immediately hit back. But that really hurt me, because I think there was a couple of things. I think primarily it was a reminder that my dad was absent, and that really hurt, because I was a young boy who wanted my father in my life. And secondly, I'd only ever experienced that word as a slur. No one had said to me, Pakistan is a country in India that was separated from India, partitioned in 1947. No one had explained that to me. I couldn't have told you where it was on a map. And so that it was just this negative thing, and I just didn't want it to be part of me, because it just meant that was the kind of the doorway to me being racially abused and rejected and not wanted from my family. So I just really wanted to push back against it. And I suppose in many respects I wanted to be white. I mean, how did that show up for you in terms of, did you choose one identity over the other? Did you feel safer in one than the other?
I did, yeah, most definitely. But I still, it's a difficult thing, isn't it? Because I gravitated towards the Irish family, and that's where I ended up staying. The English side of the family, the behaviour was a big issue, and the way they behaved towards me and my Irish side of the family. That was a key factor, really, to kind of drive me across to say, well, you're more Irish than British. But of course I'm not, I'm half and half. I still have lots of admiration for, the UK, because I live here. I'm half British, but there's also a part of me that is Irish. So I see myself as pretty much, down the middle. But I guess, I probably do err to the Irish side more. I don't have any connections with my English family since I was probably the age of 21, because of all of the bad feeling, and also the racism and the memories of growing up in such a chaotic environment, I guess. How would you identify yourself now today?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I'm English. I think that's I've been raised English. I'm very English in my tastes and sensibilities as well, probably. But it's taken me a long time to really come to terms with my heritage, and I'm on a journey with that, and I'm not ashamed to say I'm Pakistani anymore. I'll be honest, when I was younger, I used to work on the doors. People would say, "Oh, where are you from? Where are you really from?" And I'd say, "Oh, I'm Italian," but I don't speak it. I don't know my father. So half of that was true,
The English side was very nasty towards me, and I would get, I was only a child, maybe 7 or 8, from 7 or 8 years of age, I can recall, being told, you have a thick Irish family, and that saying nasty things about my Irish side of the family. And, we don't mind a few jokes now and again, but it kind of got more than that, and I was a child. And it's not until you're older and wiser that you realise that what they were saying back then was clearly wrong, and they shouldn't have been speaking to me in that way. And certainly, saying things about my mother and my Irish side of the family, and it made me then kind of question me. Am I stupid then, because I'm part of an Irish family also? And it was that environment that they created that then makes you lose self-worth, I guess. And then you feel, well, I'm not good enough, because you're constantly being told this or reminded this in a way. So it sounds like that you suffered something quite similar there.
Yeah, I had a lot of self-image issues. I mean, because Pakistani or Paki, which is what they would say, I would hear it all the time at home, and particularly like my grandparents on my stepdad's side, I would hear it all the time, referred to, the Paki shop and things like that. And it was used so negatively, and it was mocked, and I knew that was part of me. So I had lots of self-image issues, a lot of self-conscious issues, and wasn't confident around things like dating and so on. Way into my 20s, and probably even now, even though I'm married. But that really affected me in a big way. And another thing was that I kind of lived with this perpetual unsurety about whether people were ever being genuine, because I really wanted to have a relationship with my step granddad. And, he would teach me to fish and things like that. And it was really nice. And we'd watch war films and stuff. And it was nice. But then hearing him be so racist and kind of, negative about people of colour and so on, made me think, is he just being nice to me because he feels like he's got to, because, I'm his grandson-in-law? What's really happening there? And I think that's something that's really stuck with me a lot of the time. Are people just abiding me because they sort of have to? And same with schools and workplaces and friendships and relationships and gyms and all sorts. I always have that little feeling, are they just being nice to me because they've kind of got to? Yeah. And what do they really think? And particularly around race as well. But it could be other things too. So that's something that's really lingered with me, because at that time I just was never sure who would genuinely like me, if anybody.
So here's an interesting question. At any point, did you have any, or was you convinced to have racial hatred towards other people because of their views? Were you taking on their views as a child?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's it's true. It's true, actually. I can't hide from it. I think I didn't like Asians. I didn't like Asian men particularly. There was a period in my life where I just felt negatively about them. I didn't do anything. I wasn't outwardly racist, but like we know now, things like unconscious bias and so on, and prejudices, and I definitely had that. But really, it was aimed at me. That's what was really going on. And as soon as I did my inner work, it sailed away, and I couldn't get to. I've been desperate to get to India and Pakistan and stuff since. But I definitely had that. But that was because of the experiencing the rejection and the judgment as well. I mean, you mentioned about they would say negative things about your family. I mean, I had so much judgment all the time from my Pakistani side, and it really wasn't warranted. I just wanted a father. Even when he got cancer and I got back in touch with him, desperately just seeking connection that I've always wanted, they would murmur that I was only there for money and so on. So still there, that background judgment and this idea that, and again, even though my dad was ill and sometimes I was caring for him, there were people in the wider family that didn't know who I was. I went to his funeral, and there were people at the funeral that didn't know who I was. And they pushed me to the front, and I'm there at the front with all the other sons and close relations. But I know behind me, people are thinking, this is odd. Who's this guy? It's very strange to be just a working class lad, but kind of treated like some sort of, I don't know, in the royal families of old, they would have a bastard, that's sort of hanging around. It's really weird, but that's been my experience. And so it went with me all the way to the funeral, the not being sure, who knows, and people learning at the funeral and going, okay, so it was really tricky. And so that led me to, at that time, I had a lot of unfinished angst for that culture and so on. But now, of course, I know that was a very small and particular and more familial culture, and doesn't represent Islam and doesn't represent Pakistani culture at all. But this is at a time when I hadn't gone to university, I hadn't explored my own mental health and so on. In my unconscious, what I'd learned from all the race, and it's just the voices of racism growing up, And a lot in the culture and typecasting and things like that happened in comedies of old and things of old, which, don't get me wrong, I find them funny and so on. But as a culture and as a community, led to me having these stereotypes that people like with those names and so on are less than the great English crusader that my stepdad had a tattoo on, English crusader and so on. And those kind of strong figures, Churchill and all that, that was taught to me as strength. No one taught me there was any strength to be had in being Pakistani.
No. And it's quite ironic, isn't it? Because, we've encountered all of this racism from people, mainly when I was young, which were British people. And it's ironic, really, because this country's been built on, foreign people. The Gurkhas and people like this, the Gurkha regiment, all of these people, they fought for the country, that we're happy to live in now. So the last thing we should be doing is really behaving that way towards them. But it's interesting, the question I asked way back about possible going down the wrong road and taking on those racist views of your family. I was in danger of that, and I can remember that as a child and going into teenage years, and it took a while for me to understand. Well, I'm just repeating what these guys are saying to me, and I couldn't understand why. And I've always held that, and I'm ashamed that I listened to them and thought that was okay to behave like them also. And it's not until you do some soul searching and you understand what's going on around you, because you are a product of your environment. And until you break that cycle and step out of that, it's very difficult to understand what's going on. And that's something that's really, it bears heavy on me, really, that I was, if you like, being groomed by a racist side of my family. That's the way I see it, because I was a child and I shouldn't have been spoken to like that, and people shouldn't have behaved that way in front of me.
Obviously I was a smart kid, I was under no illusions about what he thought, and in a sense he was a white supremacist, in a sense, really, that's what he thought, because he always had negative things to say about Chinese, blacks, Asians, anything. But I looked up to him and I wanted his attention, and I wanted to be seen as good or proficient or cool in his eyes. And so I got into the things that he got into, and I wanted to kind of dress in that way. And, and I think that was the same of many people who had those views. And I think that part of that was safety, and part of that was just wanting that acceptance and belonging, and at what cost? Well, I suppose the calculation of me when I was young was, well, what's the cost of not having that belonging? And it's something, so I've got to go for it, because there's nothing else. There's no other alternative for me. So I think what I sit with is that there is a moment in time, if I'm really honest, where I've looked up to the wrong people. And they've had the beliefs about the world and about other people, which now, in my authenticity, in my true self, I find abhorrent and would argue and fight to the death over. But back then, it wasn't really about the issues. And I think this is a common thing. I think young people experience this. I think older people experience this too, where they are, in a sense, malleable, because what they really want is that connection with somebody. And if that means, well, I'm going to be of this political persuasion, or maybe of this religious persuasion, or whatnot, that's a smaller cost to pay or a burden to bear than not having that connection. And I think that must have been a calculation that I made when I was young, and that was really what fueled that, as I said earlier, me getting into that chav culture and me having those negative thoughts about Asian people was not really truly for me. It was just being like, yeah, I agree with you and I'm on your side.
Acceptance.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that might then bring an end to my suffering
Yeah.
in a way.
And
If I can get
would
fully
agree.
accepted.
I would agree completely with what you said there, looking up to the wrong people. That's a very good word, because I'd done exactly that. And it wasn't till years later that I realised that those people I was looking up to were not really the people that I thought they were. And that was a difficult time, I think, in my life.